Rosie Blacher. I think that sounds better.
Okay, let us start the final session of our conference. This final session shall begin with a paper entitled Sensory Experience in a Passage to India by Rosie Blacher from Kingston University, London.
I don't think we can hear you so well.
I'm just seeing this mic, which is on. Okay, so let's go back to my beginning. Welcome to the final session of our conference. I don't see our third speaker yet. I hope he will appear at some point, but let's not get there. Okay, so it's Rosie Blacher from Kingston University, London, who will be talking about sensory experience in a passage to India, a slightly different title from the working title which you have in your program. Okay, the floor is yours. The microphone is yours too.
Thank you very much. Okay, so this paper will look at the representation of the senses in A Passage to India, with particular focus on the sensation of touch in relation to the Marabar Hills and caves. So firstly, I want to question why we are looking at the senses. Sorry. Thank you. So the senses are a way of understanding the world on a personal and physical level. Julius Bernstein argues in The Five Senses of Man that through the senses we gain knowledge of the occurrences and objects which belong to the external world. During the era in which Forster's text was written, sensory manipulation was also used as a means of contributing to colonial power structures. Constance Classen, a sensory historian who's written extensively on the senses, has stated that there existed a European hierarchy of the senses, with sight and hearing associated with cognition and placed above and apart from the so-called lower senses. This idea was taken abroad during imperial missions and contributed to imposing Western behavioural ideals on the colonies. Andrew Rotter has looked into this and compares the uses of the senses in the 19th century relationships between Britain and India, as well as amongst America and the Philippines. Rotter argues that all human relationships, including imperial ones, are shaped by all five senses. He also argues that the senses are gendered. The so-called lower senses, taste, touch and smell, are often associated with women, seeing and hearing with men. Supposedly higher senses of sight and hearing, then, are typically attributed to intellectual prowess. Those are the acts of thinking, paying attention, language skills, learning, memory and perception, as well as masculinity. The Marabar caves remove these allegedly superior and rational senses for their visitors. Oral clarity is removed in the caves, as in the text we hear the guide explain that to shout is useless, because a Marabar cave can hear no sound but its own. The caves are described as being dark. Even when they open towards the sun, very little light penetrates down the entrance tunnel into the circular chamber. There is little to see and no eye to see it, until the visitor arrives for his 5 minutes. Without sight and hearing, visitors to the caves are left to rely only on smell, taste, and, importantly, touch. What can we learn from looking at the sensory distortion in the caves then? What happens when you remove sight and sound? So the caves themselves, the site of the unconfirmed incident, are first introduced to the reader in the opening chapter of the text. So Forster links these physical features with touch as he describes the vast, flat landscape where only in the south, where a group of fists and fingers are thrust up through the soil, is the endless expanse interrupted. These fists and fingers are the Marabar Hills, containing the extraordinary caves. Forster repeatedly references the fists and fingers of the cave throughout the text. This not only humanises the landscape, but also offers juxtaposing associations for the reader. This contributes to the ambiguity of the caves and the incidents that take place there. They also foreground the idea of touch. Fist has connotations of aggression, violence and anger, whilst also suggesting a negative or painful consequence of contact. Fingers has slightly more ambiguous meaning. It could be friendly, sexual or exploratory touch. In The Senses and the Intellect, Alexander Bain notes that touch is not merely a knowledge-giving sense, as they all are, but a source of ideas and conceptions of the kind that remain in the intellect and embrace the outer world. The notions of size, shape, direction, distances and situation of external bodies may be acquired by touch, but not by either taste or smell. Fingertips have more touch receptors than other parts of the body, so the inclusion of fingertip, or fingers, arguably suggests a more sensitive and sensuous quality to the caves. Later on, the caves are also described as having skin, which is depicted as marvellously polished and reflective of the matches that are used to shed light on the unknown area. Skin is the biggest sense organ of the human body and the medium for the sensation of touch. So describing the caves as having skin not only gives them further human qualities, but also ascribes them sense receptors themselves. So Constance Classen also states that touch is not only highly complex in itself, it's also closely related to the other senses, as well as to the emotions. Touch, therefore, has emotional connotations, as well as physical sensory implications for the experiencer. Indeed, we'll look at how touch links to relationships, both platonic and romantic, in this paper. So much like the ambiguous implications of fists and fingers, the interactions in and evolving the caves are similarly dichotomous in their representations of touch. When Aziz, Mrs. Moore and Adela arrive at the caves, the fist-like associations continue. As Forster describes, close above the mud was punched a black hole, the first of the caves. The use of punch suggests an aggressive or sharp force penetrated the rock and gives a visual image of forceful hostility. Soon after, when Aziz discovers Adela is missing from the caves, he physically enacts his own aggression, as when the guide was in reach, he struck him in the face for a punishment. The man fled and he was left alone. This violent act confirms that the cave, much like its depictions have suggested, is a site of hostility. So we can ask, does this confirmation of a violent touch taking place in the caves mean that the reader should assume that sexual touch took place between Aziz and Adela? Forster suggested that he initially wrote the text with the intention of Aziz being guilty. But we also have friendly touches in the caves, as during the group's exploration, Forster twice mentions Aziz holding out his hand to help Adela climb the uneven ground of the caves. This enacts a friendly touch between the two with caring and helpful connotations. This is emphasised by Aziz letting go of Adela's hand when she offends him by asking how many wives he has. Letting go of her hand indicates that they are both physically and emotionally distanced following this interaction. Aziz and Mrs. Moore also confirm their friendship through touch. After deciding not to visit the caves anymore, Mrs. Moore verbally validates their friendship, whilst at the same time laying her hand on his sleeve and thinking, despite her fatigue, how very charming, how very good he was, and how deeply she desired his happiness. Whilst the friendship between the two is mentioned several times in the text, their verbal interaction is not extensive, and their physical touch is rarely mentioned. This touch on the arm, although taking place through clothing, arguably alludes to the more sensitive possibilities of touch in the caves. Conversely, when Mrs. Moore and Adela finally reunite after the incident, Adela twice tries to touch Mrs. Moore's hand, and each time Mrs. Moore withdraws her hand. The touch is not reciprocated or wanted and indicates a cessation in their friendship, much in the same way as when Aziz withdrew his stabilising, guiding hand from Adela's in the caves after she offended him. These events show a similarity between Aziz and Mrs. Moore. They both reject Adela's hand of friendship. Mrs. Moore has a similar experience of not knowing who touches her in the caves. She says that she lost Aziz in the dark and didn't know who touched her, and she couldn't breathe. So we also go on to looking at hands and communication. So prior to the visit of to the site of the contested touch, there are several instances of the use of the hand as a method of communicating between characters. We have a handshake as a means of showing happiness. When confirming her visit to the cave, Aziz says farewell to Adela and pumped her hand up and down to show that he felt at ease. We've also got an example of a handshake showing cultural misunderstanding. So when Adela introduces herself to Nawab Bahadur and held out her hand, the old gentleman judged from so wanton a gesture that she was new to his country. We've also got an example of a hand gesture to encourage silence, when at the club Mr. Turton waves his hand to stop Adela talking. Before leaving for the caves, Mrs. Moore ponders human emotional connection. This consideration of communication between humans is accompanied by the feeling of someone taking her hand. Forster writes, she felt increasingly, vision or nightmare, that though people are important, the relations between them are not, and that in particular too much fuss has been made over marriage, centuries of carnal embracement, yet man is no nearer to understanding man. And today she felt this with such force that it seems itself a relationship, itself a person who's trying to take hold of her hand. Here, Mrs. Moore casts doubt on the benefits of human physical or marital union, emphasising that corporeal unity is superseded by detachment and a lack of compassion and empathy. Mrs. Moore distinguishes between understanding through touch and understanding through intellect, and seems to advance towards a more modern way of conceiving relationships. She also seems to suggest that one sense alone cannot be relied on to understand the world or human connections. Indeed, Mrs. Moore comes to the conclusion through experiencing sight, the vision, as well as touch, the force trying to take hold of her hand. It's interesting to note that whilst Mrs. Moore identifies that touch doesn't bring human understanding, her body feels forcefully and physically handled by her recognising of this. So Ronnie and Adela's relationship in the text is characterised by indecision and an inconsistent engagement. After breaking off their engagement and going on a car ride together, it's a touch of the hand between Adela and Ronnie that reignites their engagement. As visibility diminishes and touch takes precedence in their interaction, Adela notes that her esteem for Ronnie grows when his face is in darker lighting. So I've got a little quote there. She said her hand touches his owing to a jolt, and one of the thrills so frequent in the animal kingdom passed between them, and announced that all their difficulties were only a lover's quarrel. Each was too proud to increase the pressure, but neither withdrew it, and a spurious unity descended on them, as local and temporary as the gleam that inhabits a firefly. These hand touches happen twice more in the text. Her hand touched Ronnie's again in the darkness, and to the animal thrill there was now added a coincidence of opinion. And then shortly afterwards, Ronnie's hand touched Adela's again. She caressed it definitely. He responded, and their firm and mutual pressure surely meant something. Here, when the characters cannot rely on sight, they fall back on the sense of touch to communicate and ascribe emotional meaning to the gesture. The restoration of the engagement can also arguably link to the idea of the hand in marriage. So prior to visiting the caves, Adela's intention is never to touch and physically come into contact with India. Her desire is only to see the real India, suggesting she covets a detached visual spectacle, not an immersive experience. Interestingly, the visuals that she declares to admire in India are reflections a moon reflecting in the Ganges, which appears brighter and bigger, and the pretty reflection of the lit match in the cave wall. Adela's appreciation for the sights are arguably not for the real, but the reflected. It's only when considering the prospect of marriage at the bridge party that she expresses a desire to touch India, specifically the lovely Malabar Hills. So she, at the party, she replied, contemplating the hills, how lovely they suddenly were, but she couldn't touch them. In front, like a shutter, fell a vision of her married life. Marriage seems to render touch impossible and vision static, as she fears she would see India always as a frieze, never as a spirit. Marriage here presents a cessation of haptic interaction with the outside world. It seems that Adela's desire to touch the hills cannot coexist with Ronnie taking her hand in marriage. Interestingly, the desire to see the real India also wanes after she and Ronnie call off their engagement. When realising she doesn't love Ronnie during the cave expedition, Adela stood still, her eyes on the sparkling rock. There was esteem and animal contact at dusk, but the emotion that links them was absent. She shares Mrs. Moore's vision that marriage does not always bring understanding. Adela realises that during the car encounter in the dark, the two experience touch, but without sight and without the cognitive side of interaction. This links back to Klassen's ideas that touch is closely linked to the emotions. During the incident in the cave, Adela also loses her field glasses. These are in fact Ronnie's field glasses, which we will learn when she mistakes a toddy palm for a snake. It's not only the darkness of the caves that removes her cognitive sense of her sight, but she also literally loses Ronnie's vision. She cannot share his visualization of life in India or their life together. Adela is almost blinded in the caves, not only by the dark nature of them, but also by her preoccupation with marriage. After insulting Aziz by asking how many wives he has, Adela, not seeing him, also went into a cave, thinking with half her mind, sightseeing bores me, and wondering with the other half about marriage. Sight and marriage are once again linked, as Adela notes her boredom with the visual as she mentally detaches herself from her upcoming marriage. This inability to see Aziz is echoed in her memories of the experience in the trial. She cannot place him in her memory. She is too pensive to notice his presence or absence. Of course, it's not only the sense of sight that the Malabar caves remove for the visitor, but it also impacts their ability to hear. The approach to the Malabar Hills presents a distorted oral experience, as a new quality occurred, a spiritual silence which invaded more senses than the ear. Life went on as usual, but had no consequences, that is to say, sounds did not echo or thoughts develop. Here, the multisensory pervasion of silence is linked to a lack of cognitive advancement. The caves themselves do not create their own sound, but reflect a powerful, repetitive, and what Mrs. Moore describes as terrifying, echo. In a similar diffusion on silence, the reader never hears Adela speak her claim of being touched in the caves. The reader is never privy to her side of the story, as she does not speak after her experiences until the trial, where she still struggles to communicate to the myriad onlookers. Forster also removes the reader's vision of the events in the caves. Like the visitors, the readers cannot see or have verbally illustrated for them the alleged incident between Adela and Aziz. This lack of sight distorts the traditionally oculocentric nature of the West and foregrounds the supposedly lower senses, destabilising the traditional attainment of truth. To conclude then, touch and vision are tangled together throughout the text. One sense acting alone creates an unverifiable event, much like Mrs. Moore's belief that physical touch through marriage does not bring intellectual comprehension. It's only through multisensory cooperation that we can reach understanding between humans.
We'll have you back for questions in 20 minutes then. Yes, this started to work, unfortunately. So now our second speaker just needs to... Yes. Just a moment of a literary bromance. Okay, so we're talking about
Thank you.
Okay, so Julia Szołtysek, Dr. Julia Szołtysek, I should say, from the University of Silesia and Katowice, our native Poland, will talk about a literary bromance, E.M.F. Forster's Rites of Passage, and Damon Galgut's Arctic Summer.
Thank you very much, and thank you for staying on despite the temptations offered by Olsztyn and such a beautiful summer day. Right. So the present paper focuses on Damon Galgut's 2014 novel Arctic Summer, in which Galgut sets off to creatively retell the vicissitudes of E.M.F. Forster's writing his opus magnum, A Passage to India. Galgut's work, however, proves to be more than a fictionalized biography of one of his major influences. It is, perhaps somewhat uncannily, an immersive evocation of Forsterian places, people and events that are granted a fresh and deeply modern take in Galgut's account. The affinities between Galgut's and Forster's novels run deep, starting with the very fact that the title of Galgut's work is verbatim the title of Forster's unfinished fragmentary novel which he started in 1911. Galgut's Arctic Summer thus performs several feats, from serving as the backstory to Forster's A Passage to India, and also as the background to the creation of Forster's Maurice, to depicting the profound change which occurred in Forster, that is, we could say, his maturation as both a writer and a human being. Thus, in what follows, I discuss how Damon Galgut's mindful and sensitive narrative reveals Forster as a complex and conflicted individual, at once a conscientious objector to war, a dissenting colonial subject, and a harsh social and political critic, an avid, if a bit neurotic traveller, and finally, as a closeted gay man with dreams of a happy ending. Arctic Summer loosely traces the 11 years that saw the genesis and creation of Forster's A Passage to India. Thematically, the reinterpretation hinges on what Justin Cartwright describes as Forster's, quote, ambivalent relation to fiction and sex, unquote, notable in Galgut's portrayal of Forster's creative struggle and his friendships founded on homosexual desire. Working from this premise, I intend to address the generic ambiguities, the intersecting forms of the novel, and the genres of autobiographical fiction, so as to investigate whether and in what ways they herald a peculiar form of literary affection, pursued by Galgut through the means of very unique narrative stylistics, such as the use of a subjective internal voice, metafictional elements, and paratextual material. While all of these might indeed gesture to affective affiliations beyond the boundaries of the text, I propose to see them as elements of a bromance, albeit one that is entirely structured and played out in terms of literature. In order to explore Galgut's authorial political sensibilities and analyze the hybrid form they assume in his novel, it is vital to look at self-reflexive gestures in the book, because indeed, Galgut's author and subject seem to share views on narrative craftsmanship, the philosophy of friendship, affection, desire and insubordination, not only on the physical pages of the work, but also by implication in real life, that is, in how the author and subject approach, perceive and read social, historical, real writers, artists, and relational subjects. In this, Galgut might be seen as taken on a nearly impossible task, assuming the roles of a novelist and a biographer, given how critics are coming to agree that no biographer can keep their own autobiography distinct from the biography being written. A biographer, it seems safe to assert, inevitably empathizes either positively or negatively with their subjects, as in the process of psychological analysis, transference takes place, some sort of a blurring of personal boundaries. Rachel Morley calls this, quote, the praxis of collision between biography and autobiography, or a writing self-writing, end of quote, regardless of explicit or implicit fictionalization. A good illustration of that, apart from obviously what Galgut offers in Arctic Summer, could be, for instance, Sarah Leffanu's work and her extensive biographies of Rose Macaulay and Mary Kingsley, titled Dreaming of Rose and Strangers to Themselves, because while retracing the footsteps of her subjects, Sarah Lefanu overrides their stories with her own accounts. In this, engaging in, as Morley puts it, quote, a quest to understand and transform the self through a journey mediated by feeling and self-discovery, end of quote. Morley then goes on to note that, I quote again, by virtue of the intimacies it extends, it offers the biographer access not only to the private sphere of another individual, but also into the biographer's own mortal personal being, whether acknowledged or otherwise, real or imagined. This is, of course, the essence of biofiction. In Michael Leckey's words, quote, a postmodern form of biography which implicitly concedes through its dramatization that it cannot accurately signify or represent the biographical subject because the author's subjective orientation will always inflect the representation. When tested against what Damon Galgut says about the affinities between himself and Forster, the connection proves to be very palpable indeed. And I quote here, Forster's life in certain key respects overlaps with mine. Arctic Summer was a way of being able to write about someone else, but also more covertly about myself at the same time. We're both gay, we're both writers, we both have this ongoing fascination with India. We share just a general sensibility to some extent. I relate to the way Forster thinks and feels, and I don't relate to the way many writers feel. Of course, there is no irrefutable identification between Galgut and Forster, despite the author's expressed elective affinity, and scholars have long debated the validity of claiming the author's biographical presence in the text. Yet, Galgut's comments usefully attest to the entanglement of his own artistic and personal concerns and how these overlap or connect with Forster's. The internal and deeply subjective mode of narration inclines readers to see Arctic Summer as Galgut's passage to India, voicing what Forster could not in his novel, and showing us how Morgan conceptualizes aesthetic approaches to counter what he defines as, and I quote, a smooth spherical quality, the perfect circle that eludes his writing because of the conflict in him, in him and around him, end of quote. A way out of this impasse, Morgan comes to realize, is to, quote, work the conflict out on the pages, end of quote, and to obscure the personal from the public's, that is, the reader's eye. In Arctic Summer, Morgan's character admits the correctional nature of writing when the narrator says, writing showed his own failings to him. The struggle that was involved was a demeaning and dutiful one, a matter of grinding craft rather than lofty art. Not that he was a fake, his interest had always been real. Damon Galgut reiterates that very same point in an interview by observing that writing is a grinding craft. It's a series of problems that you have to solve. Invariably, you don't really know the answers when you start, and the process of writing the book is actually a way of finding out why you're writing the book. The pleasure lies in using language well. In this, Galgut lays bare the bond that his writing and his writerly consciousness share with Morgan's. The various forms of affinities implied here between texts, writers, subjects, and characters underscore the main theme of Arctic Summer. Importantly, though, these affinities extend beyond the clearly delineated realm of the text, involving also several orders of what Mathilde Slabbert calls peritextual elements, which are, as she puts it, skillfully reinterpreted in Arctic Summer and appropriated by Galgut in his peritext to demonstrate how friendships are forged, affect the self, and change a life beyond the boundaries of the text. The textual feature concerns author dedication, the issue of making public the private, to disclose aspects of the self in interrelation. Now, the author's dedication in the passage to India reads as follows, dedicated to Saeed Ros Masood and to the 17 years of our friendship. Galgut, in turn, dedicates his Arctic Summer to Riyaz Ahmad Mir and to the 14 years of our friendship, echoing Forster and implicating himself in an authorial act which generates a dialogic relation beyond the narrative boundary, whereby Galgut acknowledges his close relationship with a particular Indian man and to India's inspirational role in his own life and work. Writing friendship in this way denotes a narrative act of self-definition, whereby the public display of friendship is a public declaration of the self. Galgut's literary echo further points to use Derrida's terms, the possibility of a politics of friendship, end of quote, between authors that surpasses the notion of time, life and death, which Galgut's Morgan thus comments upon. In the end, the simple formulation of the dedication made him happy, but he was happier still at the thought of their two names joined together in this way, proceeding forth into the wider world. People he had never met would know that he had an Indian friend who had been part of his life for a long time. End of quote. From the reader's perspective, what flares up as particularly thrilling is how the reader, in fact, becomes a witness to, if not a participant in, this web of affinities. The narratives of Arctic Summer and A Passage to India connect histories and identities from different temporalities and spaces. Of course, there are also affinities of a more carnal nature, even if Forster would have been the last one to admit these to anyone, himself including. Repressed as he was in his sexuality, Forster would not reveal, or at least, for a long time, would not dare revealing the physical urges and desires he experienced. What we know of these and how they were playing themselves out during the long 11 years he spent writing A Passage to India comes down to us in a very straightforward form in Arctic Summer. That is, filtered through Galgut's character of Morgan Forster and how he eventually succumbed to the repressed passions. Apart from demystifying the facade of normative sexuality or the latter lack thereof in Morgan's life, when he describes Morgan's physical encounters with men, most notably his first lover, the Alexandrian tram driver Muhammad, and later Kanaya, one of the servers at the court of Devi, I think, Galgut enters here a more public and political discussion of the colonial gaze and the bigger picture informing it. In this light, to read the depiction of Morgan's encounters with either Kanaya or Muhammad through an essentialist lens would be ignorant of the narrative's critique of exploitative sexual practices in the colonies and the abuse of power of both colonizer and colonized, a point which was addressed in depth by Professor Monk during her plenary speech yesterday. Indeed, it is crucial to realize several things. That by engaging physically with Kanaya and Muhammad, Morgan is by and large doing the nasty orientalizing thing that so many of his compatriots and other Euro-American expats and tourists were guilty of. An example that comes to my mind would be Paul Bowles, for instance, although at least he was very honest about his proclivities and motivations and the frequently transactional character of his entanglements. On the other hand, indeed, in such encounters, none of the involved sides can be considered blameless, because the whole thing is about exploitation. But then perhaps we can speak of one form of exploitation that by the colonizer upon the colonized as being worse than the other. It seems that Morgan, via Galgut though, has been aware of the unequal power distribution. It is only when Morgan comes to realize that his behavior toward Kanaya had roiled the bottom of his character that the level of his moral decay is representative of all the faults of the empire. Of course, while we can assume and wish for things some values dear to Morgan, here it is, after all, Damon Galgut, the biographical novelist, the South African gay writer, doing the realizing on Morgan's behalf. And while Galgut, of course, uses sources and checks the facts, he also invents them, like when he cannot find corroboration of a particular event in Morgan's letters or diaries, and thus we need to acknowledge that this is still an act of creation which ultimately distinguishes the biographical novelist from the biographer. At the level of form and structure, Arctic Summer further obscures claims to essentialism precisely because Galgut dedicates the bulk of narrative space to Morgan's contact with men such as Masood, Muhammad, and Kanaya or Bapu Sahib. In this way, the narrative privileges their stories and their roles in shaping Morgan's life rather than the reverse. Consequently, Morgan, as a mediocre individual who became famous because of his creative contribution to English literature, does not emerge as any kind of heroic figure. According to Michael Lackey, this practice of positioning other mediocre individuals alongside the key subject of narration is an important feature of contemporary biographical fiction, and one that distinguishes it from and counters the conventions of the classical historical novel. Throughout this short paper, I have argued that the self-reflexive gestures and narrative strategies in Arctic Summer reflect the author's, Damon Galgut's, and the subject's, Morgan Forster's, shared creative and sexual sensibilities. Galgut's Morgan seems to struggle through the pages of Arctic Summer in a catalogue of embarrassing situations, some of which border on black humor. It is crucial to acknowledge that in his role as the biographical novelist, Galgut had a challenging task. Many incidents from Forster's life are known in a sparse way, and Galgut had to read several sources and interpret them to fill in the gaps using his imagination, and then base his decisions whether to include them or not on the likelihood of the events thus revealed as actually having taken place. This narrative and compositional weaving of historical and social public events with the personal and the private marks Galgut's novel off as a singular endeavor and more than just an experiment in literary biography. As I see it, it is a testimony to literary comradeship and the lasting impact that Morgan Forster's A Passage to India exerts over subsequent generations of writers. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Can we have the first speaker with us here to answer the questions? I will pick up the most mobile microphone to get questions from the audience, and your hand is up first. Here you are.
I have a question for Rachel. I loved the piece. I'm also committed to the ways in which the sensorium connects Forster's representations to space beyond writing. So I was, a lot of the data that you very thoughtfully inventoried for us, I've been thinking a lot about. You probably already know this. In the 50s, there was a debate in art history between people like Greenberg and Herbert Reed, and they called it the optics-haptics debate, okay? And Greenberg was a champion of the painter Jackson Pollock, who would sort of flick paint on the canvas, and he was taking the side of the optics as a basis for artistic aesthetics. Reed was interested in the haptic, which came out of Reed's commitment to ceramics and glass and touch. So I loved the data you brought forward, and I totally responded to the optic-haptic tension that Forster is bringing, and the worldviews that differentiate the world we experience when we touch as opposed to the world we experience when we see. So I'm just wondering, as the scholar, how are you theorizing the relation between the optic and the haptic? And for me, in my work, I'm looking a lot at phenomenology, right? Looking at theories of A lot of it is French. Merleau-Ponty is the phenomenology of mind is a key text there. But just as I love the approach. I'm just wondering how do you bridge the divide? Because obviously, we're all taught from the time we're children, right, that we have five senses. But the question is, they're all in motion and in action at the same time. Sight, hearing, taste, touch, feeling, right? It's not five different boxes. I'm just wondering how do you theorize the distinction between the optic and the haptic? Thank you.
Thank you. Well, the honest answer is this is all going towards my PhD project, so I'm only kind of halfway through, so I haven't completely figured out exactly what I'm doing, if I'm completely honest.
Sounds great so far.
Thank you. So I've been looking at kind of, originally considering like effect theory and kind of this idea of the body being in a web of relations. But I've also been looking a lot at kind of historical texts about the senses. So that's, and my project is going to be looking at the senses in travel literature over quite a big period of time, with a passage to India being at kind of the end. Mm-hmm. So I've been looking at kind of Alexander Bain, Julius Bernstein, starting to look at Herbert Spencer. Yes, it is a work in progress. I have scribbled down your suggestions. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Good luck.
Thank you.
Okay. Other questions from the room? Up there.
Yes, thank you both very much for two terrific talks. I've got a very general question.
Yes, it's something.
It's a very general question, really directed at Julia, but others.
Okay.
The mic's a little spotty, David.
I think this one is good, much better. It's simply battery which is dying.
How's that?
Perfect.
Yeah, so this is kind of directed more at Julia, but I mean anybody here might be able to help me out, okay? Which is this very interesting point about biofiction in general, and it seems to me that biofiction and biography are very close together in the way that historical fiction and history are very close together, and the boundaries are pretty permeable. And this is very interesting because, of course, history is also a reduction to writing of something. But my question is this: why do you think it is that there is such a contemporary interest in biofiction, particularly novels about writers? And we think about the two, about Henry James, David Lodge, and Con Turbine, and then there's Priya Parma, and the Wolf, the Stevens sisters. Why do you think this is the moment for that sort of fiction? Because I mean, it's I've been scratching away at it, and I really can't understand why it's happening now.
Wow, thank you. That's a brilliant question. And honestly, I mean, really, anyone could help me out here. Because honestly, I know, but the thing is that I'm sure, like all of us, I've been reading quite a lot of that sort of writing recently, and it's been quite recently indeed. So I'm wondering if that points to some sort of turn in reader interests. Is it connected with is it connected with different ways of also engaging with reading? I'm thinking, I'm kind of rambling a little bit, but I'm thinking about the experience of my students and how they approach reading. Well, the good thing is that they read, so yeah, that's one thing. But thanks to all the the social media that are there, and that also influence the ways they enter certain works. I'm thinking if that also shifts the emphasis on certain authors and artists, allowing people to interact with them in a way that it would not be so limited to, the approach of that would limit the experience of just reading something and accepting it. Yes, this is the great time-honored and tradition-sanctioned biography. That's something that we have to just accept and memorize if it's for some educational purposes. But trying to show that even in those writers or artists of old, there is a lot that could link them to very contemporary sensibilities. And honestly, this is what I found reading Galgut's Arctic Summer. I mean, I've always been very fond of Forster, even though I do not consider myself, I'm very humbled by your expertise regarding Forster, but yeah, he felt to me like one of the heavyweights of English literature. But reading works like Arctic Summer, that it did allow me to learn certain things about his biography, but also to see him as a more flesh and blood sort of character. And I think that's something that is also very exciting for younger readers. I've tried it with some of my students, and yeah, they were also very much into this. So I think that's something that perhaps we need to keep an eye on and see how whether it's a trend or whether it will go on, and for how long and what directions it might assume. But please help me out. I mean, if you've got any thoughts on that, then thank you very much.
Yeah, I think flesh and blood is really, and I think it also connects to
the flesh and the blood,
idea of
the senses.
touching. Yeah, and I think the gender and sexuality aspect is also very interesting in this regard, and I think this has prompted also a trend in biofictions. I was talking with Howard about The New Life by Tom Crew as well, about John Addington Symonds and How to Kill Us. But I'm also thinking about the swimming pool library, in which there's the scene about in which they go and see the original production of Billy Budd, and so I think flesh and blood, giving flesh and blood to those characters is definitely an important aspect, and reinscribing sort of non-normative identities and types of friendship that echoes what Simon was talking about earlier in history and in our vision of history, more generally speaking. Thank you both of you for your presentations. That was fascinating. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Oh, sorry. Okay, any more questions? Okay, so I think it's time for a round of applause for our final speakers. And this is where we part. This is the end. I have to move it a little. I hope I'm not disconnecting anything. Okay, so here we stand, the organizing committee. Nothing would have happened without these two ladies. And these are not mere platitudes. This is real. Nothing would have happened without them. Okay, thank you very much for coming to Poland. Thank you very much for coming to Olsztyn. Thank you very much for being here for these 2 days and a half. This is where we part, after a little lunch. We still have lunch to attend to. Obviously, when a conference ends, this is not the end, because there is something that follows, and this is usually a volume of proceedings. So now it's my turn to speak about this. We have already sent you an information about the possibility of publishing in PS, and that's the plan. We hope December this year we shall have a volume of proceedings, which will concentrate on the non-Passage to India. But Passage to India papers are not excluded. If you feel like that you want a publication right now, right here, and PS is okay for you. I know that the world is gone crazy and there are just like 3 real journals that really matter, and your deans and your rectors will hate you for not publishing in those 3. But it's your choice. However, this is the final information that I have kept for the very, very end. We will also publish a book. And here Maxime Petit represents my co-editor in some way, Professor Laurent Meillet. We plan to publish a volume on A Passage to India. And we have big plans that are not very specific yet. But the level of specificity is that we expect your submissions, not the chapters, but summaries, 1-page summaries. We shall send a more detailed call for papers as soon as we have fixed it, but that's the plan. There are already 10 people on board, so some of those present here are already in the know, but we expect more chapters just to kind of balance out Professor Trivedi's volume that you have been leafing through during the last 2 days. So there will be a message on that. Obviously, our conference stays online for some time. So if you want to share what you have experienced in person, please make sure to send the link to our YouTube channel to your friends, and just inform everybody in the wide world that of our existence, of our plans. The PS edition is not limited to proceedings. So if you think that some of your friends might be interested in submitting a Forster-related paper, we will be happy to receive such a submission.
Okay.
Okay.
Your turn.
Well, you've said all, really. So another big thank you for coming, because to organize conference is one thing, but you always need the audience, and you need people who would like to participate. And I greatly appreciate all the questions, because the worst thing that can happen during the conference is that people have no questions and are not really interested. But here we had very interesting papers and equally interesting questions, comments, and discussions, which we very much appreciate. So thank you very much.
And Jana asked for a photo. I think it's a great time to ask you to come, and maybe someone could take a picture of us. It would be a nice thing.
All of us?
Yes,
Yes,
all of us.
yes.
Oh, great.
We need Uber.
Yeah.
Sorry? We need Uber.
Hugh.
Hugh. All right. Right. Definitely. When you said Q, I didn't match it with the person who in Polish, yes. Yeah.
Uber, c'est le français, quoi.
I'm taller. Okay.
I'm shorter.
Shorter people. I guess we end up here on this.
Yeah, we could have some people sit maybe and another who's standing behind them, or we could use these.
When are you in Warsaw tonight and then flying off tomorrow. Back to Ireland.
Do you have duties? Can you get some rest? Okay. So,
please, holiday after that, so it'll be
facing the camera. Close up the transition.
I mean, I have a sister in Berlin. I've seen you. Very lovely to see you too.
We are waiting for. I can maybe rush that.
We're going to need 2 rows.
Thank you, Jane. Thank you, Jenny. Thank you so much.
The camera.
Okay.
So you can check if you look like your I think we are all no. Some more people coming.
Chairs and have another room
Dobrze, dobrze. Ustawi pani aparat. Raz zrobię zdjęcie.
Tylko na tą kropkę. Nie?
Tak, 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 tak.
Anna, do you think we should just bring in some chairs and have a sitting row also because we I think we should know.